My name's Cynthia, and I'm a 21-year-old college student, and I was born in Fountain Valley. I think my experience of growing up in Orange County is a little bit different than most, just because I've always felt as if I've had a double life. Because even though I was born in Fountain Valley, which is close to Westminster and Santa Ana, but that area is known as Little Saigon, I grew up in Aliso Viejo, and that has a more predominantly white demographic. And so during the weekdays, I would go to school in my area, but on the weekends, my family and I would always travel down to Little Saigon, and that's where I felt more close to my culture. I think compared to a lot of Vietnamese people in Aliso Viejo and in Southern OC in general, it's harder for them to keep in contact with their culture because there's not as much of a Vietnamese demographic compared to Little Saigon. And it's actually really interesting because I think a bit about how in Vietnam there's the northern, middle, and southern region. And even though it's all one country, everybody is different depending on what region that you from. I know my mom just had a whole rant where she's like, some people from the south, that's where my family's from, are nicer, and we tell you the truth. But people from the northern region, they're fake. Just letting you know if you ever meet someone from the north. And it's something here where I found that Vietnamese people from Westminster are different than Vietnamese people from Irvine or Vietnamese people from Aliso Viejo. I think part of it comes from being able to be surrounded by people from your own demographic. From what I've known, Vietnamese people from Westminster are more outspoken and more confident compared to Vietnamese, people that are living in Huntington Beach or Aliso Viejo, where there's not as much Vietnamese people in general.
Mhm.
I think OC has a very particular aspect about it in that it is weirdly segregated, I think, compared to more metropolitan cities like Los Angeles or San Diego, where you'll find different communities intermixed with each other. OC is weirdly gridlocked. Like, I tell this to everybody when they ask about Orange County. All the Vietnamese people are in Little Saigon. All the Korean people are in Koreatown. All the Japanese people are in Costa Mesa. All Mexican people are in Santa Ana. And so I don't know, this is more so of an issue that I think a lot of people go into that we don't necessarily realize. For me, it was hard growing up in a place that didn't necessarily have much of a Vietnamese population, just because so it's kind of hard to put my finger on why, but even growing up in my own school, all the Chinese kids would be together, all the Japanese kids would be together, all the Korean kids would be together, and there wasn't that many Vietnamese people, so I would just be by myself. And it was difficult because I never really felt quite at home in growing up in Aliso Viejo. There weren't that many people that could understand a lot of the culture that I had back home, and also the way that I was raised. And I think that's why when I did come to know some Vietnamese people in the area, we were able to connect better on our shared culture. Like, I was able to share that experience with them, but also more importantly, my parents were able to connect with their parents over their experience growing up as Vietnamese minority kids. It's very easy to feel like an outsider, but I think what helped was having that little community in Little Saigon and be able to reconnect with culture. For the longest time, I didn't realize I was growing up in America, which might seem really weird because my parents never taught me English until I went into kindergarten. So I had the biggest whiplash because everyone's speaking a different language, and I was like, wait, what's everyone saying on my first day of kindergarten? And I was like, y'all, something's wrong, something's off. And I remember going back home and I was like, Mom, everyone's speaking weird. Why are they talking like this? And my mom was like, oh yeah, just letting you know, we live in America where people speak English and not Vietnamese, so you better catch up. And for the longest time, it was really hard for me to kind of fit in with a lot of my classmates because, well, one, I didn't know English from the start, so I had to play a lot of catch up in kindergarten, but also there were so many American things that I didn't know because my parents had immigrated here, but they've always lived within Little Saigon. And so we've never really fully integrated into American culture until my siblings and I arrived. And that's because I didn't even know things like, it wasn't until I was in fifth grade when people would tell me like, yeah, we listened to the radio in our car. And I was like, wait, you listen to the radio in your car? And they're like, yeah, there's music on it. And that was so weird to me because my parents and I never did that. I remember telling my parents about that. And they're like, wait, you could actually play the radio in your car? It was like a whole new cultural move in my household. But also things like Christmas or Labor Day. We never celebrated that. And it was so weird because I would see everybody at school get festive and be like, oh, like my parents always do this tradition when it's Thanksgiving, we always get together and eat. But I never really grew up with that. So for me, I always had a big culture shock growing up in Aliso Viejo because I think me being the first child in my family, it was a lot of me learning more about American things and introducing that to my parents. It's kind of hard because I'm like, how much do I want to throw my parents under the bus for this segment? Because I was talking to like one of my Vietnamese friends earlier. I was like, Vietnamese parents like are low-key kind of traumatizing. Like a relatively well childhood where my parents like fed and clothed me and everything, but there's a really big difference between the way my parents brought me up and versus my parents. And I think part of it comes from culture. My parents aren't necessarily people that are very direct with their words. Like we don't say necessarily like I love you or we hug you, but we'll do that with other things. Like the common experience for Asian kids is that like if your parents are mad at you and you have an argument, they don't say sorry, they just give you a plate of fruit and everything's fine. And so my parents have always raised me to be as best as I could be. My parents were very strict on me just because I was the first child, and the difficulty of like raising a child is not only figuring out what you as a parent need to provide, but I think the difficulty for them was also raising a child within the American school system or going through the world because it was a lot different for them growing up. And one thing that I often think about is that this will probably connect on later on to the interview when we talk more about the Vietnam War, but I always grew up thinking that I was poor. Like my mom, when I was little, would be like, any day now we're gonna lose our roof, or we can't go out to eat because that's too expensive. Things like, oh, I couldn't get whatever toy that I wanted, or that we always had to be frugal and we had to use everything up. The whole idea that like you have to finish your food, otherwise it's all gonna go to waste. And for the longest time, my parents always raised me with a scarcity mindset that things are going to run out. It wasn't until I would talk to my other friends that I was like, wait, we're not actually poor. We're middle class. It's just that my parents have this notion that this sort of stability is going to leave whenever. I think that kind of stems from their experience living in Vietnam, because when the Vietnam War happened and the fall of Saigon followed right after, they lost everything. And so for a lot of Vietnamese parents, there's always that sort of scarcity mindset that you need to use whatever, or you can't let any sort of resource go to waste. And I think that's something that they passed on to me. And it's still something that I do a lot now. Like I conserve money. I don't like spending it. I think it's kind of good for my bank account, but at the same time, it's also kind of hard to let away the notion of, yeah, I can buy stuff for myself, or I can like get more luxurious experiences, or if I want to go eat out, that it's all right and I'm not wasting away money. I think for the most part, they're very satisfied with it. I think what helped them the most was that California has the largest Vietnamese population compared to other states. And so for a lot of refugees at the time, it's just helpful to be able to have a community of your own, especially because one thing that I'm very aware about is that there aren't that many things that are accessible to the Vietnamese population, especially towards older Vietnamese immigrants who might have trouble understanding English. There's a reason why older Vietnamese immigrants will go to a Vietnamese doctor or a Vietnamese dentist or go to a Vietnamese grocery store. And I actually had this conversation with other people who aren't of the Vietnamese community who will be like, why you guys always stick to yourselves? Like, don't you want to help like fit into the American community? And it always makes me feel a certain way. I once had an older woman that wasn't Vietnamese come up to me because I was talking about how the church that I go to have Vietnamese mass, and asked, well, why don't you guys go to the English mass? Like, isn't it all the same? Like, why do you guys have to separate yourself? And it's not a matter of separation. I think what a lot of people don't understand is that the Vietnamese community needs something in their language, in their own culture, in order for it to be accessible. And so that's something that I realized about, especially when it comes to politics in a way. I think a really hot button issue within the Vietnamese community and in a lot of immigrant communities as well is that there isn't that many news sources or media outlets that show information in their own language, and that's really difficult, especially when you're trying to talk about really big issues. And that's something that affects the Vietnamese community because most of the news information sites or reports are normally conservative. And the reason why I point that out is that the Vietnamese community, especially the older Vietnamese community, are known to be conservative. And I think that's for several reasons. One of which is that it's a part of assimilation of wanting to kind of fit in a little bit better within American society. But I think the second of which is that there aren't that many media outlets that are in Vietnamese that give a more diverse set of political opinions. And the hard part about this is that that's why there's so many people within the Vietnamese community that believe in conspiracy theories or like whack news, like the election was rigged, or that like Trump getting COVID was like a democratic attack. It's because there's actually like all this misinformation on Facebook where a lot of Vietnamese people get their information from, and no one's correcting them about it. But I think what's also difficult is that I think my parents have adjusted into life well, but there's also a lot of events where a lot of times their time in the war affects the way that they address certain issues. Like when COVID hit, there were a lot of Vietnamese people that were trying to get as much supply as possible from grocery stores compared to when people were telling everybody like, hey, like don't buy all the toilet paper in the grocery stores. We assure you you're fine. And I had a conversation with my mom about this because she was talking to me about how Vietnamese people are sometimes a little bit more selfish sometimes. And I asked her, I was like, why is that? And she said, well, most likely because it reminds them of the wartime when everything was scarce. And so their first thought isn't, oh, let's help everybody out. It's, I need to protect my family. I need to protect my kids. I need to get everything possible to make sure that we make it through. And so that's kind of just one of the instances where the Vietnamese community still shows these trends of not wanting to repeat what happened during the Vietnam War.